Hello, welcome to our weekly look inside Syria. I'm Hazem Seeker. Well, it's been a week that grabbed the attention of the international community. The Syrian National Coalition says more than 1,000 people have died after government forces fired rockets with toxic agents. The attack allegedly happened in the eastern Damascus suburb of Ghouta in the early hours of Wednesday. But the Syrian government has denied the claims. Previously, the United States, France and Britain have said they have evidence that chemical weapons have been used before in the Syrian conflict. President Obama has called the use of chemical weapons a red line. But if the allegations are true, Wednesday's attack would be by far the most serious. Meanwhile, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon is asking the Syrian government to allow UN inspectors full access to investigate these latest allegations of chemical attacks. Now, that follows rising international condemnation, with France leading the way with calls for stronger action. France says it's willing to use force if allegations of chemical weapons use in Syria prove true, while Turkey's foreign minister says that all red lines have been crossed now. Ahmed Davutoglu also criticized the UN for its inaction. But Iran has rejected that Syrian troops deployed the weapons, saying if such an attack was proven, the rebels were responsible. Germany has urged the government to grant full access to UN chemical weapons experts to investigate the attack. Well, Al Jazeera cannot independently verify videos of what happened in Ghouta last Wednesday, but to know more, hopefully, we are joined now from Chesana in France via Skype by Dr. Ralph Trapp, a chemist and toxicologist. He's also an independent consultant in chemical and biological weapons disarmament in Geneva. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Trapp. First of all, based on your knowledge of these things and what we've seen so far, the videos and so on, is this consistent with a chemical weapons attack?
Good afternoon. The answer to your question is yes. What we've seen on these video images posted on the internet clearly shows the aftermath of an attack with a poisonous substance. And it shows a large number of people who are suffocating, who are showing difficulties of breathing, all the signs of an intoxication with some sort of a very strong toxic chemical agent. It's, at the same time, no indication of any other injuries, no indication of cuts and bruises and things that would be the impact of things like explosives or other types of weaponry. So I think we must, unfortunately, be very certain that a toxic agent was used.
What sort of chemical agent do you think it was then?
This is when it gets a bit more complicated, because the footages you've seen on these images are slightly not contradictory, but there are different signs and they're not necessarily all consistent. I know that some colleagues have concluded that this was probably a nerve agent, possibly sarin, and some of the video footage doesn't indeed show as though we are looking at nerve agent poisoning. There are other pictures which are less conclusive and which could, by themselves, not really tell us what the agent is, but it clearly is a poisoning that we are looking at.
And how difficult or easy, perhaps, is it to deploy an attack like this?
Well, if you have the weapon, then the use of the weapon itself is not really that difficult. The question is, how can you acquire the chemical agent? We know the Syrian army has a stockpile and there are chemical weapons in the stockpile which could be used. It is another question how other forces or participants in the civil war could possibly acquire such weapons.
Is it possible then that people on the opposition side could have acquired these weapons in some way?
I have serious doubts in thinking about improvising weapons, making the agent, making a highly toxic volatile chemical and then filling it into a weapon system. That requires quite a degree of sophistication, and it requires a high level of protection for those people who are doing these operations, because it's very dangerous work. So from that perspective, I would have doubts. That doesn't mean to say it's not possible to divert or steal these weapons from a stockpile if there's a stockpile in the area, and there is, as we know.
And when an attack like this happens, how much warning, if any, is there the people there have at all?
Oh, there is no warning. I mean, people who have experienced these types of attacks before can probably tell by the sound of the weapon that this was a chemical, and they may gain some extra time to put on protective masks, respirators, protective clothing, if they have it. But the problem really is we're seeing here the use of a toxic chemical in a suburban area where people are living that don't have protection. And whether you have some pre-warning or not, it really doesn't help you that much. You are in really grave trouble then.
All right, Dr. Ralph Trapp, thanks very much for your time.
You're welcome.
Well, to discuss the repercussions of all this now, we're joined by our two guests in Washington, D.C., Jeffrey White, Defense Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and in London, Ammar Wakaf, a Syrian political activist. Good to have you both with us. Jeffrey White, if I could start with you, what do you think happened here?
Well, to the best of my understanding, the regime conducted a large-scale chemical warfare attack on two areas of Damascus, East Ghouta and Western Ghouta. Looks like 3 areas in Eastern Ghouta were struck and 1 in Western Ghouta. This is part of an overall or larger military operation in the Damascus area. It was carried out by, with classical military kind of chemical warfare operation. Strike early in the morning, optimum time to attack in conditions in the Damascus area. So I think there's little doubt that this is a regime directed action.
But if you look at the timing of this attack, the argument has been made that an attack like this makes no sense from the point of view of the Assad regime. They've made significant gains on the battlefield recently, and this is. And why would they then now do this under the very noses of the international inspectors who are in the country to investigate other claims of chemical weapons attacks? I mean, it doesn't add up, does it?
Well, it adds up to me in certain ways. First of all, I don't think the regime cares very much about what the UN thinks. And it can completely control the access of the UN inspectors to the areas that were struck. And we're seeing that there's no progress on the inspectors getting any closer to the areas. But on the military side, the regime has been having a lot of trouble in the Damascus area. The rebels continue to fight, especially in the 2 areas we're talking about. The regime has launched repeated offensives into these areas to clear the rebels out unsuccessfully. They're losing troops in these battles, including troops from their allies, Hezbollah and Shiite forces. The rebels themselves are conducting some successful, tactical actions in these areas, seizing weapons and so on. So the regime is seeing, I think, a very difficult fight in the Damascus suburbs, and I think the motivation may well have been to try and break that resistance and to achieve some kind of significant success in these areas.
Ammar Wakaf, what's your assessment of what happened here?
I think the ease with which people are accusing the Syrian government of carrying out this atrocity comes with quite a few arguments. First of which is that it is the Syrian government who has A, possession of such chemical warfare weapons, and B, the capability. However, people forget that the rebel forces equally possess such chemical warfare weapons.
Well, what evidence do you have of that?
Turkey, in late May, they seized 2 kilograms of sarin gas in Adana, south of Turkey, along with 12 people of Jabhat al-Nusra that is operating in Syria, al-Qaeda affiliated people who are operating in Syria. The 2 kilograms are theoretically capable of killing 4 million people. There are videos. If you go to my Twitter account, search my name on Twitter, it's Ammar Man, the account name, you will find 3 videos that I posted recently this morning, and they will show you enough evidence, even though they are in Arabic. The gentleman who compiled the videos actually targeted Arabic audience. They will show you that they were doing experiments on rabbits. They will show you that they're launching canisters through tear gas, riot police guns, and I can assure you probably they were not doing any tear gas against the Syrian government or attacking government forces. And they basically, if you have sarin gas, just like what happened in Tokyo subway in 1995, you don't really have the need for a sophisticated delivery system to cause havoc. The Japanese perpetrators used 500-millimeter bags that they punched with their umbrellas to kill people and you know, injure hundreds of others. And so they have the capability, they have the weaponry, and all that is needed, and you know, is the motive. Now, there are quite a few massacres that took place, all being well reported in the international media, that all horrendous, that coincided with either a UN chief inspector coming, or the UN Security Council meeting on Syria, or this great envoy coming. Al-Khalidiyya, for example, massacre took place when the UN Security Council on the 4th of February discussed Syria when the Russians and the Chinese used their vetoes. Al-Hula massacre, for example, it was when Kofi Annan arrived. Yesterday it was when the UN inspectors arrived to investigate, actually, in Khan al-Assad, the possible use of rebels of chemical warfare. And suddenly we need to understand that every single time the Syrian government wants the world to believe what it has to say, a massacre takes place in order to divert public opinion towards the opposite.
There are mass killings that are taking place in Syria on a very frequent basis, and people who are listening to you say this now would basically argue that you don't really have any evidence to back this up other than the timing, that it's very easy for you to make this argument.
Well, I told you that Reuters reported in 31st of May that Turkey seized sarin gas with Jabhat al-Nusra people. I told you there are videos that are showing them using and experimenting on chemical weapons, even bombarding one place. And in that bombardment sketch, it actually says he was trying to redirect the bombardment for 25 meters in order to hit the target. He said, I'll use one sarin gas shell. And he did actually mention the word sarin gas. But the issue is that I am presenting this argument so that people don't readily accuse the Syrian government of carrying out this attack. In fact, Sana, the Syrian news agency today, just reported, actually, before we came, that Syrian troops entering the eastern neighborhood of Jobar near Damascus actually suffocated and were subject to poisonous gas, and some of them are actually in critical position. These are infantrymen that are going into you know, rebel-occupied territory and try to free it up. And you know, we cannot just sit there easily and say, well, it's all the Syrian government.
Jeffrey,
in fact, every single politician.
Jeffrey White, are we too quick to assume that the Syrian government is behind this?
We have to be a little bit careful. There is, you know, I would say, you know, a very small possibility that maybe some rebel forces were involved. But the Syrian government basically had the means, the motivation, it has the military capability. And we're not talking about a subway type attack here. We're talking about, you know, a fairly significant number of weapons being used to achieve the concentrations necessary to kill the numbers of people we're talking about. We're talking about a coordinated operation beginning early in the morning. We're talking about other military operations following on to that. So, you know, basically, you know, the thrust of the evidence we have clearly points at the Syrian regime. The Syrian, you know, regime and the Syrian government reporting on these incidents has been so fallacious over so long a period that for us to accept any stories about their infantrymen encountering poison gas in areas that they've moved into that was employed by the rebels, it's just, you know, very hard to accept that as having any merit whatsoever. I would say that maybe if they did find poison gas in an area where they moved into, it may be their own poison gas. So, my view is, okay, you know, we have to accept there's a small possibility, but I think that's, as was said yesterday, a vanishingly small possibility.
All right, let's put that point to Amr Wakaf there. There are credibility issues, aren't there, with some of what you've said?
I mean, I know that a lot of people have chosen from the very beginning to fall victim to smearing campaign against the Syrian government, but the Syrian government, as I know as a Syrian citizen, tells a lot of the truth. They don't probably tell everything, but I have seen much more fabrication on the other side than I've seen on the Syrian government side. Now, going back to the capability question, now what has been said throughout the past 4 days actually is that it is only the Syrian government who has the capability to deliver. And ballistic missiles were thrown into the argument. You know, I can assure you that, for example, a Scud missile has like a 1-ton warhead. That's 500 times the amount that was seized in Turkey, which is capable of killing, theoretically, obviously, 4 million people. If such an attack takes place with a ballistic missile, you know, whole neighborhoods, whole cities could be wiped out. It's not about 100 people falling victim here and 100 people falling victim there. These are small concentrated weapons that can easily be administered by a mortar shell, which the rebel forces more than possess, which, you know, possible explosive devices, AEDs, you name it. The scale, even though it is quite spread in a large area, but it's actually small concentrations here and there. And the argument about the Syrian forces moving into an area or a territory and then sniffing their own gas, well, sarin gas is quite volatile, for example. It evaporates within 30 minutes. We've had 4 days since Wednesday now. I think people need to consider the evidence that it might not be the Syrian government. And I do reiterate the issue of these solid massacres coinciding time and again with a UN activity in parallel to UN activity or significant UN activity regarding Syria. Some person has the motive. Unlike the Syrian government, they've launched a military operation on Wednesday, and they were on the ascendancy. Someone has the motive to diffuse that. Someone has the motive to shift the focus of the UN team from examining the possibility of a rebel attack in Khan al-Assal near Aleppo to the possible government attack near Damascus. That's what is needed here. Jeffrey, and there are all sorts of repercussions that we've seen from the international scene to probably endorse that.
Jeffrey White, I want to put this to you. It's been argued that this could have been done by someone within the Assad circle or a faction within the Assad circle, worrying that he is willing to compromise and forcing him into a hard line by carrying out this type of attack. Is there any credence to that, do you think?
Again, this is kind of a nice theory. The Middle East is great for conspiracy theories. But look, what we've seen, I think, from the beginning of this war, Bashar al-Assad is the face of the war. As far as we can understand, he is, at least a key member of the group that's running the war, if not the full and earnest leader of the regime side of the war. So we have to put the blame on the regime, right? And Bashar al-Assad is part of that regime, a key part of that regime. So talking about internal cabals operating, somehow out of his control, I think that's nice and it makes kind of a nice story, but it isn't, I think, the central story here. The central story here is that the regime is willing to use any amount of force to crush the rebellion. Bashar al-Assad has shown throughout the war that he is willing to employ any kind of weapon against the civilian population. Incendiary bombs, fragmentation bombs, heavy artillery, Scud missiles, other kinds of missiles, incendiary weapons, thermobaric weapons. All these weapons have been employed routinely now against the civilian population.
Jeffrey,
the regime is striking.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to ask you. We've heard President Obama say more than once now. He's talked about red lines being crossed, about the use of chemical weapons in this conflict being a game changer. This is not the first time that we've gotten reports of an attack like this. Where does this leave the international community now? Is this not a game changer?
Well, I think it's creating an enormous amount of pressure to take direct military action. Countries, leaders are going to have to, look at the evidence and come to conclusions about it. If they conclude that the regime did indeed conduct this kind of large-scale attack on a civilian population, then I think there probably is going to be some kind of military action. How much and where and what kind of military action is harder to say. But this was such a large-scale event, as far as we know about it, that I think the pressure is going to really be there to take direct military action against Syrian forces.
Ammar Wakaf, what's your view on that?
Well, I think sending, for example, a war vessel towards the Syrian coast is a classic tactical pressure maneuver against the Syrian government. We've heard the French foreign ministers speaking clearly of using force and so on and so forth. But again, I have to go back to the issue of not having a solid case against the Syrian government here was probably the reason why the Security Council session on Syria was, and their reaction was quite subdued. I think this is the first time that they discussed Syria without airing the deliberations. This was quite behind closed doors. They didn't come out in force. They said we need to look further into this. However, the American attitude, even before the session in the Security Council took place, it has some telltale signs. They immediately went out, the spokesman for the White House, he immediately went out and said, well, look, these chemical attacks are there. The UN inspectors are there. Let them just go and have a look. I believe there is a sort of motive here for
but what's
these
wrong with
Western
them doing
powers.
that? If the object is to get to the bottom of this, to get to the truth of what exactly happened here, who was behind it, what's wrong with that?
I actually encourage the Syrian government, in theory, to let them go and investigate. However, obviously there are practical issues about their safety. I think I heard today someone saying from the opposition side that they cannot guarantee their safety. I think there is a bit of census here, but I think there is a motive now, and I don't know. I may be wrong on this, but I think now the shift has moved now a little bit in the Western, international community, from trying to prove that the Syrian government has used chemical weapons into trying to prove that chemical weapons have been used in a civilian area on a large scale. That is large enough for the international community to go into Syria no matter who the perpetrator is. Because if you remember, there has always been the theory that we need to secure the chemical weapons of the Syrian army lest they fall into the wrong hands. Well, now, if it is proven that the chemical weapons have been used in Syria against civilian targets, no matter who did, probably al-Qaeda, probably Jabhat al-Nusra, probably the Syrian government, no matter who the perpetrator was, then we need to do something about it, because obviously we cannot allow this thing to happen. I think there is a bit of a shift in the international community, the Western international community idea about it. There are quite a few preparations in Jordan that are taking place, and I think they are all leading to the same target.
Jeffrey White, just in the minute or so that we've got left, I mean, I guess the question that a lot of people who've seen those pictures of the aftermath of that attack will be asking is how many more people have to die to stop something like this happening again?
Well, it's an imponderable, but in my view, where things are moving in that direction. This was an outrageous incident. The attack overwhelmingly seems to have affected innocent civilians. Some rebel forces were killed in the attack, but the overwhelming numbers were women, children, and other civilians. So I don't think we're so much in the numbers game as in the momentum game. The Syrian regime has acted so outrageously throughout the course of this war against the civilian population. 100,000 or more dead, probably 4 or 5 times that number wounded and injured. That it's just building up that action has to be taken against this regime. I think that's the way things are moving.
All right, on that, we've got to leave it. Jeffrey White in Washington and Ammar Wakaf in London, thanks very much for your time. Now, before we leave you, there is another shameful milestone that has apparently been reached this week in Syria. On Friday, the United Nations said the number of children who have fled the violence has now reached 1 million. Most have gone to surrounding countries like Iraq, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan and Egypt. The UN estimates that 740,000 Syrian refugees are below the age of 11, and more than 7,000 Syrian children are believed to have died since the conflict began 2 years ago. Another reminder that amid all the talk and questions over who did what and why, it is the Syrian people that continue to suffer the brunt of this conflict. Well, that's it for this week. Thank you for joining us. Remember, Al Jazeera has extensive and continuing coverage of what's happening in Syria, not just on this program, but with our hourly news programs, and of course online at aljazeera.com. And if you're on Twitter, you can find me on @HazemSeeker. Thanks for watching Inside Syria. Bye for now.